Chinese President Xi Jinping began his third term in office with a series of summits in Beijing as the Chinese economy faces uncertainty amid stringent COVID-19 restrictions. So what have been the economic implications of Beijing's pandemic strategy? Why has Mr. Xi Jinping's meeting with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz been the center of controversy? And simply speaking, in what direction is Mr. Xi Jinping's diplomacy flowing? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. China's Xi Jinping is indeed seeking to chart a fresh course for Beijing. For more on his efforts, I have Professor Choo Jae-woo at Kyung Hee University joining me live from the US. Professor Choo, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Good to see you again, Sunny. I'm sorry I can't be there.
Right. Professor, I also have Professor Kim Sei-wan at Ewha Womans University joining the session from Japan. Professor Kim, it's been a while and it's great to see you as well.
Good afternoon, Sunny.
Right, Professor Choo, we'll begin with you then. Let's start off on the diplomatic front. Now, President Xi Jinping's first diplomatic agenda right after the 20th Communist Party Congress was his meeting with Vietnamese counterpart Nguyen Phu Trong. Could you tell us more about this particular meeting and its significance?
Yes, President Xi Jinping of China started to receive foreign guests and foreign head of state beginning on October 31st. And Vietnamese premier being the first one coming to China. And I think it was politically articulated because Vietnam being a socialist state, we could have made an intellectual guess that socialist state a head of state from a socialist state could be coming to China anytime soon. And apparently, Vietnamese Prime Minister, he made a trip to Beijing and he received a warm welcome from Mr. Xi Jinping. And in his remarks to the, Vietnamese premier, Xi Jinping reiterated his commitment to socialism, and he expects reciprocal response from his Vietnamese counterpart. And he also emphasized the fact that, he would like to channel through to ASEAN through cooperation with Vietnam. And he was asking for Vietnamese help in connecting the two entities. And in return, Vietnam was very positive to Xi Jinping's demands and requests. And he also reiterated his position of his country committing to this, socialism. And in the last, here's an interesting note here. Regarding Taiwan, Vietnamese Prime Minister made it clear that Vietnam will be siding with China on this particular issue. And he went into some specifics that Vietnam will oppose any kind of alliance, and it will oppose to host any military bases of foreign, and it will also oppose the use of force against any country or work with a country to oppose another. And it's quite interesting. So in other words, he made it clear that where Vietnam stands regarding Taiwan issue, and it would like to remain as neutral as possible.
Right, those were words of support from Vietnam to China with regard to Taiwan. Professor Kim, on the economic front, pundits say two major risk factors against China's growth are perhaps its COVID-19 strategy and housing market policies. Let's start off with the housing market policies. How severe is that situation, and what are the broader repercussions?
First of all, I have to say that Chinese construction industry, represented by Chinese housing market, has been a main driving force that makes Chinese economy to grow fast in the last 20 years. If you take a look at the size of real estate industry in Chinese GDP, it covers about 24% of total GDP, or 4.3 trillion US dollars, which is more than 2 times of Korean GDP. Among the biggest headwinds in China's rapid economic slowdown is worsening real estate woes, with a growing number of property developers defaulting on their debt over the past year, like the Evergrande's bankruptcy in 2021. The sector's access to market financing has been increasingly challenging as Beijing gives more restrictions on real estate market to avoid unexpected burst of bubble in the real estate market. In addition, since several Chinese real estate developers are huge and highly intertwined to global economy, slowing Chinese real estate market could be another risk to global economy and global financial market.
Right, I see. And also on the economy, Professor Choo, following his talks with his Vietnamese counterpart, Mr. Xi Jinping met with Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif to address the China-Pakistan economic corridor. Could you tell us a bit about this ambitious project?
Yes, I think, it's a very ambitious one. The sheer length of the railroad that they're going to construct on two fronts, each is longer than 1,700 kilometers, and it's going to be a mega project for the two countries, and China is going to invest a lot of money in there. So I think the construction and the project of upgrading and building of these two railroads are going to be undertaken starting next year. So I think for that matter, the two summits got together and try to discuss how they're going to, create and pave the way for these two mega projects to materialize in the near future.
Right. And Professor Kim, simply speaking, we've talked about the housing market policies that are negatively affecting China's potential economic growth. That being said, that with regard to its COVID-19 strategy, how is that looking to affect perhaps Beijing's target annual growth rate of some, I believe, 5.5% for this year?
Of course, I'm pretty much negative on China's 5% growth for this year. Beijing's strict COVID-19 restrictions shut down two symbols of Chinese economic connection to global economy. China's COVID-19 curbs forced the temporary closure of Disney's Shanghai resort and production of Apple iPhones at a major contract manufacturing facility could drop by 30% in November due to coronavirus restrictions by Beijing. It shows that the seriousness of impact of strict COVID measure on Chinese economy and global economy too. It also indicates Beijing has decided to sacrifice its economic growth to contain the spread of COVID-19. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, expects Chinese growth to slow to 3.2% this year, a 1.2% downgrade from its April projection after an over 8% rise in 2021. So this much shrink of Chinese economy from 8% to 3% level growth in a single year generates a very dangerous situation that causes lots of pains to Chinese people and risks to global economy.
Right, and yet the priority remains on the pandemic for Beijing. Meanwhile, back on the diplomatic front, Professor Choo, aside from his regional partners, Mr. Xi Jinping has also reached out to Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan last week. Well, what are your thoughts on China's agenda with this African country and to a greater extent, perhaps the African continent?
Yes, at the Party Congress, the only region and countries that Xi Jinping emphasized on further developing relationship was African countries and developing countries. Surprisingly, he did not mention about China's plan to develop relationship with developed countries and neighboring states. So taking from there, we can infer that China is going to more focus on developing relationship with those countries in the third world, particularly with African states. And I think he's going to take this occasion to send a message to China-African, Forum for Cooperation.
Right, I see. Professor Kim, compared to its counterparts, China itself is not fighting soaring inflation. I mean, its consumer price index for September rose just 2.8%. How do you explain this fortunate reality, and how does it look to affect China's economic prospects for the year ahead?
As you said, Sunny, it looks that China is not much suffering from rising price level for this year. Projections by the IMF published in October expect the inflation rate of China to reach about 2.2% in 2022, this year. The monthly inflation rate in China increased in the first half of 2022, but ranged still at a moderate level in the second half. One of the major factors of this low inflation in China is related to quickly cooling down economy or a weakening domestic consumption. China's inflation situation is quite different from that of Europe, US, and Korea. Therefore, China's monetary policy will be more self-oriented, which means China's central bank gives higher priority to boost the domestic demand. In this respect, the Chinese central bank is likely to trim one-year loan prime rate, the benchmark lending rate in China, by 5 basis points in the fourth quarter to recover economy. We know that this is totally the opposite move against other major central banks.
Right, Professor Choo, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was perhaps the final leader to visit Beijing last week amid quite a bit of controversy. Do you care to elaborate on this controversy, as well as the commitments made between these two leaders, and perhaps on their relevance?
Yes, controversy arises from the leadership change in Germany, obviously, and the newly elected leader in Germany would like to take the country to a new direction, especially regarding China policy. And I think that's, bringing a lot of concerns from other Western friends and allies and so forth. And despite their opposition, German Chancellor decided to visit China and, have a meeting with President Xi. And here, I think that's where the concern was arise in a lot of states. And I guess we can read that message from, President Xi's remarks to German Chancellor that when he highly praised German Chancellor's vision and courage to make this trip on this occasion.
Right. And Professor Kim, despite these active diplomatic activities, China appears to remain dedicated to its dual circulation strategy, which pundits claim that it seeks to perhaps turn its economy towards greater self-reliance. That being said, Professor Kim, how does this goal perhaps look to affect the global economy?
That is a very important point, Sunny. Beijing has actually recognized the incoming big risks of real estate market bubble and so many zombie public corporations in the middle of 2010. So actually, they decided to take an action on this risk in 2019, in spite of negative economic growth. But as we know, COVID-19 pandemic broke out in 2019, and it made Beijing to delay the actions to stabilize the risks from the real estate market. As of now, the COVID-19 disappears slowly, and Beijing goes back to the action of getting rid of the permanent risk of real estate market by implementing the dual circulation strategy. The core part of dual circulation strategy is raising domestic consumption, because Chinese economy could be more independent from global economic risks by fostering domestic consumption. And China's domestic consumption is relatively small compared to other nations, which is less than 40% of GDP. So Beijing will focus on raising people's quality of living by substituting imported goods by domestically produced goods. It can decrease the size, actually, of the global trade in the long run.
Right, I see, which is why we probably need to come up with countermeasures. All right, Professor Kim, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Choo, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Right. Well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. We also do apologize for the poor internet connection with Professor Choo in the US. Do join us again same time tomorrow. Thank you for now.